Fire Emblem is a pretty well-known franchise today. Since the first entry titled Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light for the Famicom was released in 1990, the series has grown to span dozens of games and has become one of Nintendo's most successful IPs. But the history of Fire Emblem wasn't always so positive. The series nearly came to an end with Fire Emblem Awakening, and there wouldn't be a Western release of a Fire Emblem game for nearly a decade after its debut on the Famicom. But thanks to shifting attitudes at Nintendo and some help from a little game called Advance Wars, Mario's parent company finally decided to give the tactical RPG a chance to make it outside of Japan. Fire Emblem 7, also known as Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade, debuted on the Game Boy Advance and is an interesting chapter in the history of a franchise that had nearly a decade of existence under its belt. Franchises with that type of longevity usually had their stories written already, but when it came to Fire Emblem, the decision to release FE7 in the States started a whole new chapter that changed the trajectory of one of Nintendo's most well-known franchises. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Unlockables podcast, the story of video games, the people who play them, and the memories made along the way. As always, I am your host. My name is Eric. I'd like to thank you so much for tuning in wherever, whenever, in time and space you may be located. It means so much to me that you're willing to stop by and check out what is going on with the show and check out what is going on in the world of video games. Before we get into our episode today, I just would like to remind everybody to go on over to linktr.ee/Unlockables podcast. You can find all of the links to social media there. I am on Blue Sky, Instagram. You can find the links to the Patreon, where for as little as $1, you can get access to episodes early and some other bonus stuff, which I'm definitely planning on doing sometime in the future. Of course, your monetary support is not required. All of the main stuff that I do on the Unlockables is always going to be on the main feed for free. It's really just early episode releases and some other kind of side stuff that I'm doing that you would get access to with the Patreon. So not necessary, but always greatly appreciated if you decide to support just a little bit more. If I could direct your attention to just a couple of the other links there, if you could go on over to TikTok and YouTube specifically and leave a like, a follow, all that good stuff. I'm trying to build up those two platforms so I can start doing a little more video, short form video and long form video stuff. I really want to expand the scope of my creative output into more video stuff. So definitely go check out what is going on over on TikTok and on YouTube. Once again, that is linktr.ee/Unlockables podcast. Now, with that out of the way, let us dive into the game that is the topic of today's episode. And that is, of course, Fire Emblem 7, also known as Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade. Fire Emblem for the Game Boy Advance, also known as Fire Emblem 7 or Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade, like I literally just said, is a 2003 tactical role-playing game developed by Intelligent Systems and published by Nintendo for the Game Boy Advance. It is the seventh entry in the Fire Emblem series. It is the second Fire Emblem game to be published on the Game Boy Advance, but the first game in the series to be localized for an international audience. It is a prequel to the story of the sixth entry, that first game on the GBA, which is known as Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, starring Roy. And if you are familiar with Super Smash Bros. Melee, you might recognize Roy as one of the two Fire Emblem stars that featured on that game. The other, of course, being Marth from the first entry, which is known as Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. Fire Emblem 7 originally started development as a companion game to Binding Blade in 2002, but was delayed to add features and make some adjustments from Binding Blade. While not slated for an international release due to Nintendo's concerns about its difficulty, the surprise success of Advance Wars in 2001 changed Nintendo's attitudes, along with the inclusion of Marth and Roy in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Those two events got the series enough attention that Nintendo thought it was worthwhile releasing it to a wider audience. Speaking of releasing, here are some of the release dates. In Japan, it released on April 25th, 2003. North America, November 3rd, 2003. Australia, February 20th, 2004. And Europe, July 16th, 2004. On the review aggregator Metacritic, it is sitting at an 88 out of 100. For major publications, Eurogamer gave it a 9 out of 10. Famitsu gave it a 34 out of 40. GamePro gave it a 4.5 out of 5. GameSpot an 8.9 out of 10. GameSpy 4 out of 5 stars. IGN a 9.5 out of 10. And PALGN 9 out of 10. So pretty good review scores, sitting at a pretty high aggregate over on Metacritic for Fire Emblem 7. By 2012, it was revealed that FE7 had sold 272,000 units in Japan alone. And while sales data for Western markets isn't really consistent, it was revealed that Fire Emblem 7 was considered enough of a commercial success that Nintendo decided to greenlight the development of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance for the Nintendo GameCube. And of course, Path of Radiance would be the game that would star Ike, another popular Fire Emblem character that would appear in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. During the 7th Annual DICE Awards, Fire Emblem 7 was nominated for Handheld Game of the Year, and the same year at the International Game Developers Association gave the game the award for excellence in writing to Fire Emblem 7, alongside such titles as Beyond Good and Evil and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Of course, if you look up lists of the best Game Boy Advance games, FE7 is consistently mentioned on those lists as one of the standout games on that system, and I definitely agree. I think all of the Intelligent System games are fantastic. I would highly recommend going to check out all of the GBA Intelligent System games, which include Advance Wars 1 and 2, Fire Emblem 7, and Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones. I think it's also worth emulating FE6. I haven't finished a full playthrough of Fire Emblem 6, but you can emulate it translated into English, although the version I remember playing was not translated that well. Maybe there's better translated versions that are out now, but I think it's worth playing Fire Emblem 7 and then going back to see the continuation of the story in Fire Emblem 6, because 7 is a prologue to 6. So starting off like I normally do with my personal thoughts and my experience with Fire Emblem 7 and the Fire Emblem series as a whole. I haven't gotten to talk a ton about my love for the Game Boy Advance on this show, but it's by far one of my favorite consoles of all time. I have some really great memories and really strong emotional attachments to the Game Boy Advance. I did do a GBA retrospective episode with Jeff and Matt of Fun and Games a while back, and I think I pretty well documented my love of that system, of Advance Wars and Fire Emblem on that episode. So definitely go and check that out. That was a really fun one to talk about, a console that we all really love and I think was foundational and formative for a lot of us. I brought my Game Boy Advance with me everywhere, even more so than my Game Boy or Game Boy Color. And it wasn't the original Game Boy Advance, you know, like the purple the slab one. I don't even know what like you call it, but it was like the purple slab one that I think of that didn't have the backlight. What I really think of when I think of the Game Boy Advance is the Game Boy Advance SP, the way that it was the clamshell design, the way it could fold down, and the way it had a lit backlight, and it had a rechargeable battery, which was game changing. And to continue to beg my parents to buy me AA batteries to keep feeding into my Game Boy because I played it so much. But back during that time, I had a PlayStation 2 as well, and it was honestly probably a toss-up between the PlayStation 2 and the Game Boy Advance of which one I played more. All my friends had Game Boy Advances, and despite having a GBA, I didn't get the Pokemon titles on the GBA. So I didn't get Ruby, I didn't get Sapphire, I didn't get Emerald, and I didn't get Fire Red and Leaf Green. I kind of had checked out of Pokemon at this point. I was on to newer and better things that I thought, and this is where I got introduced to the game that I really consider the defining game for my love of the Game Boy Advance, and that is Advance Wars. And Advance Wars is the catalyst of my love for Fire Emblem. I got Advance Wars sometime in the early 2000s after my best friend showed me the game, and I was completely obsessed with its blend of like tactical strategy and cartoon like violence. I just thought it was so cool and such a well put together package. My friend and I used to have sleepovers and play Advance Wars for hours well into the night, and it was something that we were completely obsessed with. Something about the music and the GBA graphics and the sprites and the gameplay. To me, it was just quintessential Game Boy Advance. My first experience with Fire Emblem, specifically as a series, was probably Super Smash Bros. Melee. Like many people, I was like, who are the anime sword guys who speak Japanese? And mind you, I didn't have a GameCube at this time. I got to pick one console that I could have, and I picked the PlayStation 2, and of course I had the Game Boy Advance. But in terms of like a main system, it was the PlayStation 2. I had friends that had the GameCube, and I played Smash Brothers Melee. It's probably the Smash game that I have the least amount of experience with, just because I never owned it. I've owned all the other ones. Marth and Roy left such an impression on me, and I learned, oh, they were from this game called Fire Emblem, and I didn't really know anything more about it than that. At this time, I was a Nintendo Power subscriber, and I remember that was the first time I saw Fire Emblem 7, or just Fire Emblem as it's known in the West. There was probably like a spread or a story on the launch of Fire Emblem in the US. I loved Advance Wars, and this Fire Emblem game looked like a similar art style to Advance Wars, only with medieval sword dudes instead of tanks and infantry. And that was sort of my frame of reference for Fire Emblem until it came out. I fully expected it to be like Advance Wars, except it's just medieval times. It's just, oh, we're doing the Advance Wars concept, but we're just doing it in a less modern time frame. So my friend who introduced me to Advance Wars also showed me Fire Emblem for the first time. He and I were both on a bowling league in the early 2000s, and he brought his GBA with Fire Emblem to the bowling alley, and he let me play it. I was obsessed immediately, and I was so focused on it that I was missing my turn during league, and I was holding everybody up. I figured out pretty quickly that while it was similar to Advance Wars in art style and some gameplay aspects, it was also a lot more intricate and deeper because it incorporated RPG elements. And this was kind of fascinating timing because I had kind of just discovered what RPGs were a few years ago with Final Fantasy IX and Kingdom Hearts and, of course, Super Mario RPG. So I kind of had an idea, like a frame of reference for a game where you're playing like a narrative and characters have character development and you level up, get more stats, that type of thing. So I really loved that Fire Emblem was a game that played like Advance Wars, but had systems like an RPG where you could level up and build your characters. And these characters had relationships with each other that grew and evolved with the narrative. That didn't happen in Advance Wars. The characters in that game are pretty static and exist just to be the COs, the commanding officers that have powers that you can use in battle. The COs in Advance Wars are just like the reason why different characters have like different powers and different play styles. That's really the only purpose that they serve. Fire Emblem was also the first time that I remember having anxiety around a specific game mechanic. And of course, I'm talking about Fire Emblem's legendary, well-known permadeath mechanic. You spend hours in chapters leveling up this character and getting to know them and their backstory and relying on them to help you beat chapters and advance the story. And in one miscalculated move, they could be gone forever. This was shocking to me. This didn't happen in video games, right? The game never took a character away from me when I died. Sure, if I fell into a pit as Mario, I always had extra lives. I had Phoenix Downs to bring my characters back in Final Fantasy. If I ran out of lives, I would just continue and start the game over again. But in Fire Emblem, if the characters died, they were gone for good. And this was terrifying. The experience of loss in a video game, of permanent loss, was something new and exciting and actually a little bit dreadful. And yes, you can save, you can restart the chapter, you get that character back. It's not a big deal. But when it happens in Fire Emblem, it's always a very shocking feeling. Ever since this kind of history that I've gone on, I've been a fan of the series. I haven't played Path of Radiance or Radiant Dawn or the remake Shadows of Valentia. I have played basically every other entry in the series from Fire Emblem 7 onward, and that is Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones, Fire Emblem Awakening, Fate's Conquest and Birthright, Three Houses, and Engage, and I even sunk some time into the mobile game Fire Emblem Heroes. I have it on my bucket list to go back and play some of the earlier entries. Like I said before, I have played Fire Emblem 6, but I want to go back and do a full playthrough of it and play it to completion. And I definitely want to go back and check out some of the earlier titles like Genealogy of the Holy War and Thracia 776, just for history purposes, just to understand the history of a series that I really love as it existed before it released to a more international audience. And I've generally liked every entry that I've played so far. If you get deeper into the levels of the Fire Emblem fandom, to people who have like a really in-depth understanding of how these games play and how they work and get attached to characters, some of the games grow more divisive. And like I said, this has a lot to do with characters and mechanics in certain games, as well as an argument over what the soul of Fire Emblem actually is. It's a little bit of a Final Fantasy argument in there. It's like, well, what does it mean to be a Fire Emblem game? What does it mean to be a Final Fantasy game? But I'm definitely more of a casual fan, despite my love for this series, and I've been able to enjoy each entry, even the ones that people have like not really been super high on. I genuinely think the Fates, Conquest, Birthright, Revelation trilogy in there is generally pretty good. I really enjoy it, and the characters in that. A lot of people didn't really like Fire Emblem Engage. I think mechanically, Fire Emblem Engage is the strongest Fire Emblem we've gotten, probably since Awakening. I really like a lot of the systems in Fire Emblem Engage and the way it brings back a lot of stuff that Three Houses kind of stripped away. And I love Three Houses for what it was, because Three Houses was a drastically different Fire Emblem experience than what I was used to. Usually around this time, I have user-submitted audio recordings of my community's thoughts on the game that we're playing. I didn't ask for any for Fire Emblem 7 because, again, kind of like Dynasty Warriors, I find myself as one of the few people in my community that kind of champion Fire Emblem and that have played it. Not many other people have, or if they have, they've played later games in the series. I think Three Houses and Awakening were probably 2 points where the popularity kind of peaked and where people kind of jumped in. Fire Emblem 7 is a 22-year-old game now, so I didn't really go out of my way to ask for recordings or submissions of what people's thoughts were. So we won't have that segment in here today. Again, we will just move on to gameplay, presentation, music, and talk about how the game plays. right, so I'm going to kind of lump in everything together when I talk about gameplay, presentation, music, all that stuff, because all of it kind of informs and works together in a really interesting way. So I'll just kind of talk about all that stuff as it comes up, and I'll try to describe the general flow of the gameplay and how it works so you guys can understand what you're getting into, if it piques your interest and you want to try it, and how it kind of differs from other strategy tactical games, and specifically how it differs from Advance Wars, because while the games are similar in their presentation and who made them, the games are different because of the way that they approach tactical gameplay, one from just a pure tactics standpoint in Advance Wars, and one from more of an RPG narrative standpoint, Fire Emblem. So, Fire Emblem, the entire game takes place on a grid from a top-down view, and you, the player, serve the role as the tactician who will move and direct the various characters across the battlefield in order to achieve victory depending on what the win conditions of the map are. A lot of times the victory condition will just be like defeat the boss unit at the end, or like seize the gate or the throne, but sometimes there will be unique parameters to succeed in the mission, whether it's like survive X number of turns, defend X number of things for X number of turns, or stuff like that. There are different win conditions. You get access to a ever growing and very large roster of characters that are all kinds of different classes across the 30-ish chapters that make up the game. But the main characters of the game are the Lord class. I have that in quotations. And our main characters, who are the Lords from Fire Emblem 7, are Lyn, Eliwood, and Hector. Well, we'll get to talking about permadeath in a minute. These three characters, who are the main characters, cannot die. If they do, you automatically fail a chapter and have to restart. So generally, characters that are the Lord class have better level ups, have better growths, are genuinely stronger units. A lot of people don't consider the Lords in Fire Emblem 7 particularly strong, especially compared to other Lords throughout the series, other main characters throughout the series. That caveat still remains that they are pretty strong. They're useful to use in battle, but there's always that risk reward. If you put one of these main characters, I think of the Lord characters as like your kings in chess, except imagine if the king had the movement of a queen. The Lord characters are usually pretty powerful and can usually hold their own, but if you put them out there and they die, then you have to restart. The game is technically divided into 3 sections. You play Lyn's story first, and her story is the first 10 chapters of the game, and it really serves as a in-depth tutorial for new players. Upon replays, it can be painfully slow and very dull, but for the purpose they needed it for, which was teaching a new audience about the game, it does a really great job in introducing the core mechanics and preparing you for the main chunk of the game. Lyn's story is kind of a prologue to everything that happens in the main bulk of the story. It's a nice introduction to the world and the political structure. It deals with Lyn discovering her heritage as a Lord, and it kind of deals with an inheritance struggle between her grandfather and her grandfather's brother, which is Lyn's grand uncle. Eliwood's story is the final 20-ish chapters of the game and is the main bulk of the gameplay narrative and story presentation. It deals with the main conflict of the game. It starts with the disappearance of Eliwood's father, dives into the legacy of a war between dragons and humans, which is known as the Scouring. And this part of the game deals with the main antagonist, whose name is Nurgle. Eliwood's story is considered kind of like the general difficulty of the game on normal and hard mode. It's basically like the regular standard playthrough. And then, after you beat Lyn and Eliwood's story, you unlock Hector's story, or Hector mode. And Hector's story is the same narrative and story that you play through Eliwood's story, but it's seen from Hector's perspective, and it kind of focuses in on him as the main character a little bit more. Some of the maps are revamped with different enemy placements, and there are some different cutscenes as well. I would say the difficulty is definitely a step up. Hector mode on normal and hard difficulty is definitely considered probably like the pinnacle of challenge for Fire Emblem 7, especially Hector hard mode. Beating Hector hard mode is kind of seen as like a badge of honor, and then doing like a Hector hard mode Iron Man where you like don't want to lose any units, or you play if units, you keep playing if like units die, you don't like restart chapters, is seen as a really, really tough challenge for people doing it for the first time. I've seen people who've done it dozens of times, and like once you kind of understand the game and the underlying mechanics, it's easier to go through. But for just like a casual or a newer player, Hector hard mode is kind of like the pinnacle peak accomplishment of beating Fire Emblem 7. The gameplay takes place on a map that's divided into a grid. Each map is unique in its layout and in the elements it contains, and the map is made up. Each grid square is a different tile, and there can be different map tiles like plains, forest, mountains, rivers, village entrances, arenas, thrones, gates, etc. And where you stand on one of these tiles can significantly affect your character as they go into combat. For example, if I position a unit on a forest tile, that forest tile will offer my unit additional defense and avoid, meaning that if I am attacked by an enemy, if I am hit, I will take less damage, and that enemy's chance to hit me is lowered. If I was on a plains tile, which is just a base tile that has no bonuses, then the damage I would take and the chance to be hit would be higher. Gates and thrones offer huge defense and avoid bonuses, and they have the added benefit of healing a character positioned on them for a set percentage each turn. So they are very advantageous, and they usually serve as a map or a chapter objective, and they'll usually have like the big boss unit at the end of the map sitting on them for maps that have the objective to capture the throne or capture the gate. So not only will that boss unit at the end just be tougher in general, but then it has the added defense and avoid bonuses of sitting on the throne or the gate. Plus, it gets healed every turn. So that just adds a little wrinkle into, okay, how should I approach this boss, knowing that it has these built-in advantages on top of already being more powerful than most of the other units on the map. Each unit interacts and can move across each of these spaces differently. Planes offer no impact to movement. Only certain units, like fighters and brigands, can move across mountains, albeit very slowly. Pirates can move across large bodies of water. Flying units are unaffected by most/all terrain and can basically move very far without anything getting in their way. But the cool thing about flyers is that even though they fly over all terrain, wherever they stop and land, they can still take advantage of the terrain bonuses. So if I have a flyer that flies and stops on a forest tile, I still get the benefits of the forest tile despite the fact that my unit flies, which makes flyers pretty powerful considering that their movement is huge. They can dart over mountains, they can dart over rivers, stuff that would normally be roadblocks to other units. They can just dart right over them and attack. So each side takes turns moving their units, and when all units have moved, it's the next player's turn. Or you can move whatever units you want, and you can manually end your turn even if you haven't moved all of your units. Let's say you have like a nice defensive position that you like, and you only want to shuffle around a few units, and let's say you move like 3 of your 10 units and you want your turn to be over. You just open the menu and you would manually end your turn. The main draw of Fire Emblem is you want to defeat the enemy army with your characters. So you'll be engaging in a lot of combat, and part of the strategy of Fire Emblem is choosing when, where, and how to engage the enemy. When you engage an enemy in combat, you go into a separate screen where combat takes place, and you'll see sprites of your characters do battle. And the damage that you do is affected by a whole host of variables, which some of them are like the character's stats, like what your stats are for like whatever level you are, the type of terrain that you're on, the type of weapons that you're using, etc. If you are attacking, so let's say your character initiates combat, enemies have a chance to strike back during your attacking phase and vice versa. If an enemy attacks you first, your character will strike back. And depending on when you want your character to strike, if you're initiating combat, it's called main phasing. And if you're letting the enemy initiate combat so that you can strike back, it's called enemy phasing. There are some instances in which you would like to start combat, and there are certain instances where maybe it's strategic to take up a defensive position and let the enemy attack you first. That might be worth it. And there are certain scenarios where letting an enemy attack you first is advantageous. Some characters attack directly, like cavaliers, mercenaries, fighters, etc. Some enemies can attack at range, like archers and mages, although mages do have a 2-space range in which they can attack. They can also attack when characters are right next to them. Archers cannot do this. Archers can only attack at 2 range, unless, I think in later games, if you had very specific items, you could attack. But archers can like shoot at enemies behind walls or like take cover and like attack. So archers have apparent advantages, but they also have severe disadvantages because they literally cannot engage in direct combat. So if all you have to do is bum rush an archer and get in its face, and it's pretty much screwed. I've heard the sentiment that archers are probably like the weakest in the earlier Fire Emblem games just because they have this disadvantage of not being able to direct attack. I would agree with that. I don't like using archers too much unless I really want like just to have an archer in my army. I spoke earlier about village tiles. You can visit villages to trigger special events, and this is anything from like recruiting a new character or getting some loot or item or just getting some general information about the map or the story. Brigands are like enemy bandit units. They can destroy villages on the map and will often beeline for them unless you visited them first. And this kind of adds an element of timing to the map, because if there's like 3 or 4 villages on the map and you spot brigands like going for all of them, then you have to figure out, okay, how am I going to visit all of these villages in time before they're destroyed and potentially miss out on recruiting a character or getting a useful item? Maybe the village you need to visit is like surrounded by enemies. So then you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I get a unit in there and out of there without that unit getting killed? So villages add this interesting kind of, not like explicit timer, but kind of, villages add kind of this sense of urgency, especially when bandits show up on the map to try and destroy them. There are also tiles that are armories and vendors where you can like buy weapons, items, tomes, staves, basically whatever supplies you need for your army. Arenas are interesting tiles. You can have a character visit the arena to fight a random opponent one-on-one with like basic equipment. Like they'll get an iron sword, you'll get an iron sword, and you can just fight. This can be a good way to gain some extra levels or money, because once you finish a chapter, you like there's no grinding. Like, you just go to the next chapter. You can't like revisit levels to like grind for experience or for money. So it becomes a game of managing what units get what experience and like not blowing all of your money and trying to manage that throughout the process of the game. But if you go to the arena, you can gain some extra levels and you can gain some extra money. But if your character dies in the arena, they are gone. Permadeath does not care that it's in the arena. Permadeath does not care that you're trying to get some extra experience or some money. So the arena has this risk reward element to it. You can hit B while you're in the arena to like stop the fight. You'll lose your money that you wagered and your character will come out damaged. So you have like that failsafe. But if you're too late in hitting it and the enemy strikes a final blow, and some of the enemies are like on your level and will come and just absolutely wreck your shit. The weapon triangle is Fire Emblem's famous rock, paper, scissors mechanic to determine the effectiveness of certain weapons against one another. And it goes like this. Swords are effective against axes. Axes are effective against lances. Lances are effective against swords. Magic has its own triangle. Anima, or elemental magic, is strong against light magic. Light is strong against dark, and dark is strong against anima. Using an effective weapon or an effective magic against one that it has an advantage over. For example, using a sword against an axe provides a bonus to hit, damage, and other benefits. It literally gives you an advantage in a fight. Similarly, using a disadvantage weapon against one that has advantage over you, using an axe against a sword, will make your attack much less effective. You can do this, and there are certain instances where you might think this is worth the gamble. That is just a strategic decision you have to make for yourself. But more or less, any strategic decision you make in Fire Emblem is starting with your consideration of the weapon triangle. There are specific weapons that reverse this triangle, and these are known as reaver weapons. They reverse the effectiveness of weapons in relation to one another. So, for example, a sword reaver is an axe that is strong against swords. Lance reavers are swords that are strong against lances, etc., etc. In most Fire Emblem games, at least the ones that I have played, the weapon triangle is God. Like I said, it's literally the first mechanic that you consider when going into battle. It was taken out of Three Houses, which provided the players with much more flexibility in how they compose their army and their characters. But I personally, as a old school Fire Emblem player, at least old school back to the GBA days, really like the weapon triangle. Despite its initial simplicity, I think by building the game around this central mechanic, it causes you to think a little bit more about your army and unit composition. Sure, you could bring along all sword users with you to the battle, but you would be really severely disadvantaged against any enemies if a bunch of lance enemies show up on the map, and you'll have no axes to counter enemies that have lances. I think it really encourages the player to experiment and build a well-rounded army that can handle any situation that's thrown at it. So you'll have a nice mix of characters that use lances, axes, swords, and maybe some of the different magic types, so that you have the flexibility to be able to respond to anything that the game throws at you. The weapon triangle really does kind of inform the rest of your decisions. I mean, you can say fuck it and just do whatever you want, but not taking the weapon triangle as the main mechanic into consideration is going to make your life a lot more difficult. It might encourage you to use characters you've never used before, and maybe it would discourage you from just having like 6 cavaliers in your squad, because then you don't really have a dedicated axe user that has advantage against lances. So I think the weapon triangle is an easy enough mechanic to understand, and it encourages the player to experiment and think about the units that they are bringing with them. And it encourages you to not only learn a character on a narrative level, but learn about them on a mechanical level, so you understand what weapons they use and in what situations they would be useful. Again, you can use weapons that are not effective against their counterparts if you want to. I've done it. There are, again, scenarios where you could get away with this for sure. I've used swords against lances before, and I've been caught at the disadvantage end of the weapon triangle before. It's not like an immediate death sentence if you make that mistake, but it will make your life less enjoyable for sure if you don't engage with that mechanic. You've heard me throw around classes and units for basically this whole episode. There are a number of different units in the game, and they can affect the way that you approach a mission, a chapter, a level. And all the units, all these characters have different classes. Standard units are usually on foot. They have like a default movement of like 4 or 5 spaces, which isn't a lot considering some of the bigger maps. And this is like your lords, your fighters, your mercenaries, your mages, your knights, units like that just basically walk. Cavaliers ride on horses, and therefore they can move faster. I think they have 2 additional. I think cavaliers have 7 movement versus characters on foot that have 4 or 5. Same goes for flying units. We already covered flying units, and those can be Wyvern Riders or Pegasus Knights. Cavaliers movement is heavily impacted by forests, desert, and other rough terrain tiles. Basically, any tile that's not a plains tile or something that is just like a road or a basic land tile. All units have their own level and stats and gain a level when they accumulate 100 experience points. When they level up, they have a chance to gain +1 in a stat that is determined by their growth rates. And each character has different growth rates, and not all of these characters' growth rates are created equal. Some are inherently better than others, and there are tier lists of characters as to like considering like their average growth as like which characters are the best in the game. But just for a casual playthrough, you can get away with playing with any one of your favorite units and you'll most likely be fine. So for example, if Lynn, let's just use Lynn as the example as the starting lord. Let's say Lynn has like a 50% HP growth rate. That means when she levels up, she has a 50% chance to gain +1 in the HP stat, which will give her an additional hit point. And this is a percentage for all of the stats in the game. So you can have multiple stats gain +1. If you're really unlucky, like only your like more high percentage growth rates will hit. So it really is kind of a crapshoot from playthrough to playthrough, and you could have characters with like different stats when they're like fully leveled and maxed out that will vary up your gameplay from playthrough to playthrough a little bit. The stats are level, HP, strength / magic, skill, speed, luck, defense, resistance, constitution, and movement. Not all of these gain, or some of these gain with like special items. Movement is pretty much locked until you promote, which we'll talk about promoting in a second. Or if you find you have to find a special item called boots that will give you like a +2 movement permanently. All of these stats govern different things, obviously. If you're a video game player, especially if you're an RPG player, you can probably kind of guess what some of these stats do. Strength obviously determines how much damage you can do with a weapon. Same thing with if it's magic. If it's a magic user, the strength stat is magic. And that the higher the strength or magic stat is, the more damage you'll do with weapons or tomes, respectively. Skill is reflected in your critical hit chance. Speed determines how many times you could potentially attack in one turn. So, for example, if your speed is a certain amount higher than an enemy, you can double them, which means you can attack them twice in one attack. And speed also helps you to avoid attacks. Defense and resistance factor into how much damage you can take from weapons and magic, respectively. So that's the same side of that coin as strength and magic. Constitution factors into a mechanic called rescue, where you can pick up a unit with another unit to get them out of danger. So, for example, if I like sent a unit on foot to attack a guy and he wasn't in it great, I could swoop in with my cavalier because he has a higher constitution and grab that guy and get him out of danger. Constitution also has a direct relationship with weapon weight, so all of the weapons have different weights assigned to them. If you have a weapon whose weight is more than a character's constitution, it can negatively affect them, so that's an added layer of strategy about picking weapons with certain weights to make sure that characters can use them to their fullest ability. Luck factors into many different things, like raising your hit and avoidance, and it affects the enemy's chance to get a critical hit on you. So if you have a character that has high luck, you're more likely to hit, you're more likely to avoid attacks, and the enemy is less likely to get a critical hit chance on you. Luck can also play into like finding some things on specific maps where like stuff is buried on the map, but that doesn't come into play incredibly often. Characters have a max level cap of 20, but there is a wrinkle to this class and level system. Upon reaching level 10, you have the option to promote that unit to a more powerful version of its current class. You can only do this if you have the necessary promotion item for that class. So I'll use the Cavalier as an example. If you have a Cavalier that is at level 10 and you want to promote it to the more powerful Paladin class, you need an item called a Knight's Crest. If you want to promote your mage to a Sage, the next step in its evolution, you need a Guiding Ring. And you can find these by just playing the game, or they're given to you at specific times. When you promote a character, you will often get a stat boost, and you'll get a couple of points in stats that are most often associated with that class's most useful stats or with that character's strongest growths. It's different. The promoted unit starts at level 1 and can go all the way up to level 20 once again. Now, you can promote a unit at level 10, but if you do, you are missing out on 10 level ups when they're in their base class. If you promote at level 10, you just lose access to leveling up 10 more times. So, if you want to optimize your character and give them the chance at being the best they possibly can be statistically, you should wait for level 20, promote, and then level up to 20 again. Then you have 40 possible levels of chances to increase your stats versus like if you do it at level 10, you only have 30 possible levels. So you're missing out on 10 potential stat boosts for each of your stats. And that is a significant amount when some of the stats cap out at like 20, 25, 30 as their highest point. You have a chance to max out those stats. And if you promote early, you might not be able to. But again, you have that option at level 10 to take if you need it and you have the required item. Maybe you're in a map where you feel like your army needs a little bit of a boost right away. Like, man, maybe my Cavalier would just be a little bit more effective as a Paladin if he had just a little bit more move and a little bit more like strength stat. And you can use that promotion to just get that little bit of boost to maybe make things a little bit easier on yourself. So again, that is a strategic decision you can make during your gameplay to promote early to get that more powerful unit, because units in their second class promotion are always more powerful than the base class. Being that this is a prequel to Fire Emblem 6, this game kind of sets up a lot of things that happen in that game with Roy, although I'm not too familiar with it because, like I said, I've never done a full playthrough of Fire Emblem 6. That's Roy's game. Roy is the son of Ellawood from this game. It also stars Lena, the daughter of Hector, and you get to play as both those characters in Fire Emblem 6. The game takes place on the continent of Eleb, several hundred years after a cataclysmic event known as the Scouring, where humans and dragons fought a terrible war against each other. 8 heroes rose up on the human side to help turn the tide of the war against the dragons, and those 8 heroes went on to find the 8 nations of Eleb that exist today, which is the Kingdom of Bern, the Nabata Desert, the Majocracy of Etruria, the Kingdom of Ilia, the Plains of Sakai, and the warrior tribes of the Western Isles. The main nation that a lot of the characters and lords are from that are associated with is known as Lycia, and Lycia is a confederation of like smaller city-states and kingdoms that make up like a league. The main narrative takes place surrounding this nation, which all these city-states and these smaller kingdoms are ruled by lords who have their own agenda. I mentioned Lynn's story a little bit. Lynn's story deals with her discovering that she is the granddaughter of the Lord of Kalen, and Kalen is a Lycian state, and she has to deal with her grand uncle Lundgren, who actually wants his brother and Lynn dead so that he can take the throne and rule Kalen, because Lynn's grandfather's children, his daughter, who is Lynn's mother, is already dead in the story. Ellawood and Hector's story deal with these two lords. Ellawood is the son of the Lord of Foray, and Hector is the brother of the Lord of Ostia. Ostia is the most powerful of all these states and is kind of like the head of the whole confederation. It kind of like is the seat of power. So like while they are all like they're individually like ruled little kingdoms, Ostia is clearly like the top one. Ellawood's father goes missing, and this leads to the discovery of a greater conspiracy between some of the Lycian lords working with the main villain, Nurgle, to take over the country, and Nurgle's trying to gain power from conflict in order to summon dragons back into this world, absorb their essence, and gain like unlimited power. All that very JRPG stuff that you know and love must acquire greater power to become God and become immortal, right? And we have to stop it. Classic JRPG stuff. The hardcore Fire Emblem community has really different thoughts on this game and the narrative and the story than I do. And the hardcore fans, like I said, are really into the nitty gritty of how these games work on a mechanical level that I'm not really even on. But in terms of the story, in terms of the characters and the way it's presented, I really like it. It's a story that I really love. It's one of my favorite stories in video games. Something about the configuration of the world makes me feel really immersed in what's going on. Sure, there's the overall grand narrative going on about the return of dragons and Nurgle and all this other stuff, but when you zoom in, there's some interesting stuff politically going on, especially within all the states of Lycia. There's these separate kingdoms that are all like loosely united under the banner of Lycia and Ostia, but all their lords and people seem to have like their own agenda related to their own kingdoms, and they're loyal to their kingdoms first. It kind of reminds me of like the early United States, how like your allegiance was to your state and not to like the country as a whole. Hector's brother, Lord Uther, is the ruler of Ostia, and he sits at the seat of power. He comes to power at a very young age, and Hector discusses with Eliwood how Ostia is full of spies trying to figure out how the new young ruler will rule and what moves he will make so that the other lords can like take advantage. And some of the lords are shown as friends, but others are clearly in it for themselves. And I think it just really creates this fascinating political atmosphere that I think is really unique for a game on the Game Boy Advance, for something as like, small and light as like the Game Boy Advance. It really creates this kind of like interesting political atmosphere that it kind of goes away from towards the middle and end of the game. But I really, really like the setup and how kind of like all these smaller players like interlinking kind of are jostling with one another. And then how do all these separate kingdoms respond to like a kingdom like Bern that is under one unified banner that doesn't have like this infighting between different types of city states. So it's a really fascinating political narrative that I wish there was more of, and I wish they kind of stuck to it. And I wish I got to experience kind of how that played out in terms of like the whole continent, because I think that's really, really interesting. But of course, we kind of zoom out and take the overarching narrative of, oh, this crazy guy wants to bring dragons back, and that would spell like the end of the world. So we have to kind of prevent that from happening and go away from like the political stuff. But on the narrative and storytelling end, I don't even think that the story as it's presented to you is my favorite part of the narrative of this game. I think that the permadeath mechanic and the way that you play the game creates some really, really interesting opportunities for emergent narrative, where it's a narrative specific to you, the player, and your playthrough with the characters that you are using. And I'll explain that. Fire Emblem is very heavily character driven. If two characters are in close proximity of each other for long enough, you can unlock what are called support conversations between them that flesh out the character's relationship with one another as well as their own character. And having these support conversations increases your support level. When two characters have a support level, you can have them by each other in battle, and that will give them added bonuses to combat, making this a way to encourage engaging with this narrative element. But in addition to this built-in narrative element of this relationship between these characters, my other favorite aspect of any Fire Emblem game is the emergent narrative you get to craft for yourself by playing the game. And what I mean from this is the stories that you create in relation to the characters just by playing. So let me lay out a scenario for you. Say I send one of my units to a village to stop it from getting destroyed by bandits and recruit the character from that village that I would miss out on if it was destroyed. Suddenly that unit that I sent is surrounded because I underestimated the number of enemies and how they would move, or maybe there was an ambush spawn where enemies showed up and I wasn't expecting it, and now my unit is at serious risk of being killed. And I make it to the village and I visit it and I recruit that character and we start to retreat back towards our main party, but I can't outrun the wave of reinforcements that are coming and that unit could be killed. But against all odds, that unit manages to fight off the swarm of enemies, protecting that new character until they can reach the main party. In addition to the in-game narrative that unit, that character might have, it now has and in-game connection with me because of that tense moment. The story of that character, as I played it, was that character stood down a horde of enemies to save a character that I could recruit by getting it back to the main party. And Fire Emblem becomes littered with these opportunities across the game, and it kind of builds this second layer of narrative and connection to these characters that is exclusive to the player, and not only exclusive to the player, but exclusive to each time you play through the game, because you may not play through the game in the same way each time. You may try different characters, you may try different routes, you may try different strategies. And I think permadeath plays into this really well. If one of your characters dies, remember, they're gone for good. There's no bringing them back. And this can be absolutely brutal if you've invested time getting to know that character, or if you've invested a lot of XP in them. Maybe in my last example of going to the village, that unit you sent to the village didn't survive the trip back. Maybe it died defending the other character, so that other character you're trying to recruit could live on. That adds another narrative wrinkle to your specific playthrough. Losing one of your favorite characters to gain another that you don't know. This actually happened to me in my playthrough of Fire Emblem that I played before I wrote this episode. There's a mission towards like the latter half of the game where it's at night and you need to protect the Prince of Bern from being assassinated. It's a fog of war, which means the map is hidden until your characters move into like line of sight. And I decided to split my party up. I sent a smaller contingent through a back hallway with one of my healers, Priscilla, to save a character named Jafar. And I sent Priscilla with a lot of my stronger units. I sent her with a paladin and a hero, which are two pretty advanced classes that can deal with mostly everything. And I underestimated, even though I've played this game a million times, I underestimated the movements of Jafar as an NPC and the movements of the enemies. And I got surrounded and Priscilla ended up dying. I restarted the chapter because I didn't want to lose my highly mobile healer, but that created another layer, another narrative element of that chapter if I decided to play it forward and continue on without Priscilla. I decided as the player to send a small dispatch of characters to rescue this other character that I could recruit later, and it cost me one of my most valuable units, Priscilla, who was a horse-mounted healer that has ridiculous range, and I'd had since the early part of Ellawood's playthrough. And then you kind of start to turn the wheels in your head of, oh my god, that paladin and that hero that I sent out with Priscilla failed to protect her, and now maybe there's like some animosity at camp. It was like, oh, we came to rescue Jafar, but it cost us Priscilla. There's that kind of like narrative building that goes on in your head that isn't in game, but it happens to you. And by using your imagination, then that is kind of a narrative that you have that is exclusive to your playthrough. Permadeath also does something else interesting, and it kind of separates the two intelligent system games. So Advance Wars and Fire Emblem, it separates them. Advance Wars doesn't have characters in the same way that Fire Emblem does. The units you control on the map are faceless, emotionless. You send waves of them to go to the slaughter, and more often than not, you have bases where you can just build more units because it's a more modern take on war, on combat. In Advance Wars, sometimes sending a unit to its death is an optimal strategic move, as you can usually replace it. Sacrificing a unit to save another, or deny an enemy a property, or hold a bridge for an additional turn might be worth it in the long run. It isn't nearly as punished because as long as you have income, you can replenish and replace your units as you send them to the front lines. Fire Emblem, on the other hand, makes death personal. You lose connection to a character you've been getting to know and build your own story with. You lose time. You lose resources invested into that character, meaning that your style of play will differ drastically from Advanced Wars. Normally in Advance Wars, you can brute force those missions with like relentless speed and aggression. If you're just overly aggressive and like really persistent with unit production, you can overwhelm pretty much any challenge. In Fire Emblem, you will be punished for relentless aggression because you will inevitably put a unit in a position that will cost you the unit's life. It will be the permanent loss of the character that will be the punishment for not thinking your moves through carefully. To close out this conversation, to talk about what it meant to get a Fire Emblem game in the United States as an international release. What did FE7 do for the legacy of Fire Emblem? If you're a listener of my show and you listened to an episode that I did on Advance Wars a couple of years ago, talking about how Advance Wars changed Nintendo, Fire Emblem 7 getting released in the States is due to a couple of factors. One was the success of Advance Wars. Nintendo was developing both Fire Emblem 6 and Fire Emblem 7 in tandem, but they had no intentions to release them stateside. And they didn't release Fire Emblem 6 stateside. They weren't confident in the Western market's interests in games like this, and they weren't confident in the skill of that audience to grasp the gameplay concepts of what they thought was a more advanced game like Fire Emblem that combined tactical and RPG gameplay. Then Nintendo of America, after playing a test copy of Advance Wars, begged Nintendo to let them sell the game here in the United States, to bring it over into the Western market. They insisted that it would succeed here in the States, and Nintendo decided to let them release it in North America, and it was successful, much to Nintendo's surprise. Also, I probably think one other thing played a component in this too. I think Nintendo was caught off guard by the popularity and acceptance of Marth and Roy in Smash Bros. Melee, so I think the two-pronged combo of the success of Advance Wars and the popularity of the Fire Emblem characters in Smash Bros. Maybe finally convinced them to bring this over to an international audience. The success of Fire Emblem 7 would pave the way for another GBA game 1 year later, which is known as Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, and that will be a future episode because there are some significant differences between the Sacred Stones and FE7. It paved the way for two console games in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, and I don't know much about the history of those two games, but it seems with the release of those two console games, one for the GameCube, and I believe Radiant Dawn was for the Wii, after those games, the series kind of started to stall out and was actually going to come to a permanent end with Fire Emblem Awakening. Awakening was a Hail Mary. It was meant to be the final entry in a series that Nintendo was going to be done with. But Awakening revitalized the series, and now Fire Emblem is one of Nintendo's most dependable and recognizable franchises. I don't think I would go as far to call it like, if we're doing franchises in tiers, I wouldn't call it like a tier 1 franchise like a Mario or a Zelda or Pokemon. Maybe I would throw like Kirby and Donkey Kong in there too as like a tier 1A, like a 1A, 1B, like just a step below. But I definitely think that Fire Emblem is in the next tier down with the likes of maybe like Metroid and Xenoblade and Luigi's Mansion, maybe like that second level of Nintendo IPs, of Nintendo franchises that aren't as well known as the big ones and don't sell as well, but are like still good games and good series for Nintendo. Outside of North America, the legacy and history of Fire Emblem is bigger and goes back at least an additional 10 years before these first games would come out for an international audience. But as part of a Western audience, Fire Emblem 7, alongside Marth and Roy and Melee, is the foundation of the series, is the foundation of our lens. That is where the series began for us. And Fire Emblem 7 is still the earliest, the furthest back North American release of a Fire Emblem game that you can go and play. If you want to play the earlier titles, you have to download emulators that have translations so you can play them in English unless you speak Japanese. And there are some good translations out there. I think I've read that the one for Genealogy, the Holy War, is particularly good, and that game is playable now. I have to see if there's a better one for FE6, because I remember playing the English translation of FE6, and it was not spectacular, and maybe it won't be. But Fire Emblem 7 and Roy and Marth are the foundation of Fire Emblem for the Western audience, for an international audience. We did not get to play the games that Marth and Roy were in, and Fire Emblem 7 is really where it all started for us. And without those games, without Marth and Roy, without Fire Emblem 7, our experience with Fire Emblem might look drastically different today. I have no doubt that eventually it would have found its way over here, but with FE7 and FE6 and Sacred Stones, it sounds like those games were successful enough that Nintendo decided to do a GameCube Fire Emblem game and do a Nintendo Wii Fire Emblem game. And those games didn't do well enough, and it was kind of starting to peter off in Japan and worldwide. And so they decided to do one last Fire Emblem game in Awakening, and they were going to be done with the series. And then Awakening repopularizes the series with the changes that it makes that are now like staples of the franchise going forward. And now we have Fire Emblem Engage, which is the most recent Fire Emblem game. Without Fire Emblem 7, it's interesting to think about, would we have even gotten any of those Fire Emblem games in the first place? Because Fire Emblem 7 only sold 272,000 units in Japan. Would Nintendo have felt like it was worth making a Japan exclusive game that was only selling like 200,000 copies as it grew, as the market grew? Would we have even gotten Path of Radiance? Would we have even gotten Radiant Dawn? Would we have even gotten Fire Emblem Awakening? And those games that are now looked on as iconic, with iconic characters. I mean, that's Ike in Smash Bros. Awakening has Lucina and Robin in Smash Bros. And then Three Houses has Byleth. So it's like, those are iconic games with iconic characters that maybe we don't get if Fire Emblem 7 doesn't come over to North America. If Fire Emblem 7 doesn't get released to an international audience. There's a ripple effect there from removing the decision to release Fire Emblem 7 to an international audience. Fire Emblem fills a very specific niche in Nintendo's audience. Nintendo has an abundance of like action, platform, adventure games. It's Mario, it's Zelda, it's Donkey Kong, all these games that are either action platformer, platform adventure games. All of those, that wide array of those cross genres are covered. Fire Emblem is a narrative-driven tactical RPG, and to me, it's kind of representative of the early legacy of RPGs. I know we had Final Fantasy on Nintendo, and I know we had Dragon Quest on Nintendo, and those two were heavily associated with Nintendo until PlayStation came along. But to me, Fire Emblem is a part of that early legacy of RPGs on early Nintendo systems alongside those other games. It just doesn't get talked about as much. And Fire Emblem is certainly not as big as Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy. And it has that more tactical element to it than turn-based or active time battle system. But it's still a part of that early legacy. And is probably one of the most recognizable RPG franchises on Nintendo to this day. We're going to wrap it up here. If you can't tell, Fire Emblem 7 is one of my favorite games of all time. It is easily within my top 10 games of all time list. It is one of the most influential games on me as a gamer. It is a game that I go back and play. If not once a year, I try to play it like every other year. I've played it more years than I have not played it. And every playthrough is different. Every playthrough is unique. Every playthrough I find something new to love about it. Every playthrough I use different characters, and I'm sure I haven't even used all of them yet, and I fall in love with different characters and create teams and armies that do different things. There's so much replay value in it because it's so much fun. If you're one of the people in my community who has not played Fire Emblem, I think FE7 is a great place to jump in. It's very easy to play on emulation, legally, of course, delete it after 24 hours. It is available on the Game Boy Advance offerings on Nintendo Switch Online. Go and check it out, please. It's just such a fantastic series, and I think it's not as discussed as it should be alongside of the other RPG greats, because there is great storytelling, there's great characters, there's great moments. Thank you guys so much for bearing with me for this long and listening to me talk about one of my favorite games for over an hour. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, if you'd like to catch up on everything Unlockables, please go over to linktr.ee/Unlockables podcast. All of my links for all of my social media is there. Once again, I'd like to highlight TikTok and YouTube. Please go and give me a follow on those platforms, as I'm trying to do more different creative outputs in terms of videos, whether that's long form or short form. I'm still working on some other stuff. I kind of shot myself in the foot because I said in previous episodes I'd have videos done, and my timeline for videos has kind of changed because in the middle of all this recording, we sold our house and we're going to be moving. So that's really fun and really chaotic and really exciting. The link for the Discord is also in the link tree. Come into the community. We've got some great creators doing great stuff in there if you want to discover more shows and talk about video games like Fire Emblem. Maybe you want to just post some silly memes. Maybe you just want to listen to some music that our members post in the music channel. All that and more can be found on the Unlockables Discord, and that is, once again, linktr.ee/Unlockables podcast. Thank you guys, as always, for listening, and always remember, it's not just the story of video games, it is the story of you.